I don't even know how to start this one. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to a very confusing episode of Atheist Church Audit. My name is Jared, I'm an atheist, and this morning I went back to a cult.
Why would you do that?
But even that sentence is problematic and confusing, so let's just say I went back to this church. However, I didn't go back to the same congregation that I went to previously. I went to a totally different congregation. The church that I'm talking about is the United House of Prayer for All People, abbreviated to UHOP. In my last video, I blasted this church. I mean, straight up, this entire church just felt like a pyramid scheme trying to climb the ranks just to be able to touch Sweet Daddy. And you had to pay a lot of money to get there. I gave them so much shit, I gave them hell, because there are some deeply problematic things with this church.
The bishop lives in wealth. When Bishop Bailey enters a church, members crowd the aisles to press cash money into his hands.
Now, after my experience in going to the UHOP congregation in my hometown, I was full on ready to say, this is a cult. This is bad, this is dangerous, you need to leave, you need to convince your friends and family not to attend anymore. And then I went to the congregation here, where I live now, and it was one of the best churches that I've ever attended.
What did you just say to me?
And I have so many confusing thoughts, so many conflicting ideas, and it's honestly a little frustrating because sometimes you just want a church or a cult to just sit in their little corner and be easy to hate and one-dimensional, and sometimes it's more complicated and it makes things a little bit more frustrating. More frustrating and also somehow more exciting and maybe even good.
Sounds complicated.
So let's dive into it, because this one is a doozy. So I knew that I needed to visit a different UHOP congregation, and I landed on the one that's closest to my house. So I pull up to this church, which is even bigger than the previous one that I visited, and for some reason I was just much more intimidated going to this one than I was the one in my hometown. So I pull up at 9 a.m. and I opted to join in for their Sunday school lesson. And I knew that that was a risky endeavor, especially since I knew that there's a slight chance, that people from this congregation could have seen my last video. Is this a cult? My answer is yes. And so it was in the back of my mind that, like, oh shoot, I could walk in here and immediately be kicked out of this church. So I pull up, park my car, I see this enormous church building, and I just play Russian roulette and walk up to the first door that I see. Rather than going through the main entrance, I chose one of these kind of like back alley doors underneath the church on the first level. I walk inside, and within 3 steps of walking into this building, I could tell that the vibe was immensely different. Immediately, the first woman that I make eye contact with, she smiles at me. And she's like, hey baby, welcome. Like, at a visceral level, I wasn't a threat, or I wasn't a surprise, or I wasn't, somebody to be worried about here. And then I meet a couple of other women, and they were equally friendly. They were scurrying about, preparing the kitchen for their after-service meal. And then a third woman comes up, and she hands me a COVID mask, because this church is still very conscientious about COVID. It's the only church that I've been to that has been. And just immediately, it felt warmer, like shockingly warmer compared to my previous church experience. So I ask if there's a Sunday school service happening somewhere, and she's like, oh yes sir, right through these doors. And I go into this, basement sanctuary, similar to the basement sanctuary that I went to at the previous UHOP location, and there was nobody in there. So I go and walk in, and right behind me is this probably, 70-year-old sweet as can be church lady, and she is the Sunday school teacher. So she takes her seat up at the front, shakes my hand, asks me my name, and I sit at the pew right in front of her. And this sweet angel was ready to give me an entire Sunday school lesson by myself, like literally just one-on-one.
Oh, that's kind of sweet.
But she was an angel, and the Sunday school lesson was good. It is Mother's Day today. Happy Mother's Day to all of you children people. So fittingly, the Mother's Day Sunday school lesson was on the Virgin Mary. So we're reading through the passage in Luke. She's cross-referencing some other scriptures. She had some good insights, and it was just, it was positive. And then a taller gentleman from the back room comes kind of through the side door, and sits down behind the pulpit. And, a couple of times throughout the, Sunday school lesson, he would perk up and he would say, well, that's a great point, and kind of chime in. Turns out that gentleman was the pastor. His name was Elder Young. And I ended up talking to him for 45 minutes. Now, I don't want to say this lightly. This was one of the best pastors that I've met at any church.
You serious?
His disposition was really gracious and really welcoming. And not just, hey, we want you to join our church, but he was glad that I was there and he was eager to answer my questions, which is totally the opposite vibe that I got from the previous church. At that place, it felt like everyone was suspect of me. It felt like I was threatening just by being there. This place was, I couldn't even believe that it was the same denomination. So it's just me and him for probably 45 minutes standing and talking at the front of this sanctuary. And in the basement sanctuary, it's the same as all the other sanctuaries, where you have murals of each of the 5 bishops. And to be fair, in this place, they also had a painting of Jesus. Now, in the Sunday school lesson, I could tell that this pastor was educated, well educated, like he was a smart guy who was theologically trained. Because we're talking about the Virgin Mary, and then at some point he says, well, Mary's parents, Anna and Joachim, dedicated her to God at the temple. And that made my ears perk up a little bit, because that's not in the Bible. That's in an early apocryphal document called the Proto-Evangelion of James. And that's not just information that you kind of stumble upon, that's something that you have to actively read up on. So I'm talking to this pastor at the front of the sanctuary, and I'm asking him questions. I'm open and transparent about hey, yeah, I'm kind of a seeker or whatever. And he wasn't offended. He wasn't taken aback. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't sweating. He was just ready. So I'm asking him about the bishops. Okay, how do you understand the theological significance of the succession of bishops? What role do they play in, the celestial hierarchy? If the bishop isn't the reincarnation of Christ, then who is he? And he had very sophisticated answers for all of these questions. Now, at the other church that I visited, there wasn't any of that. It was very heavy on, we just praise the bishop. We're grateful to the bishop. We're super excited about the bishop. We're lucky to have the bishop. Whereas this was far more moderate. So I'm contrasting that experience with the previous church, whereas here, at least in the Sunday school sermon, the bishop was never mentioned, which is polar opposite from the sermon that I heard in the previous church.
Precious, sweet, daddy medicine!
And to my amazement, the pastor here had some pretty sophisticated and refined theology regarding the bishop and his proper role in the realm of theology and soteriology. So he mentioned in passing, occasionally we have people in the church who will say something like, well, I just want to thank Daddy for waking me up this morning. And they're not talking about God when they say Daddy, they're talking about the bishop. And he told me, well, sometimes I have to gently correct them, hey, Daddy doesn't do that for us. God does that for us. And this bishop had a much more Christocentric theology, and he made it very clear to me that Jesus is at the core of everything that's done here, and perhaps the bishop has the greatest portion of the Spirit of Christ in him, whatever that means. I think they're looking for theological language to accurately describe the importance of the bishop, but this pastor was very cognizant of the fact that that's easily overstepped into unhealthy territory. So he gave me really good and very biblically dense answers to all of my questions. And I was like, okay, this is good. And just everything about his disposition, pastors should take note. I would be thrilled if more pastors approached me like this. Because even some normal evangelical pastors have been more standoffish than this.
Why don't you have the guts? Why don't you have the courage to get up and leave?
So cool. Pastor tells me, hey, service starts at 11. If you want to go and wait up there, you're more than welcome to. So I take the elevator with him upstairs. We're chit-chatting a little bit. And then I was the only person sitting in that sanctuary for probably 20 minutes while I waited for the first few people to trickle in. It was beautiful. Very unique architecture, very unique stained glass, and it was just a good vibe. So I'm sitting there in the pew by myself, jotting some notes down, and I'm just kind of observing all of the familiar iconography and posters. There's paintings of the 5 bishops up on the altar and a painting of Jesus off to the left. There is the mountain of God up at the front, where I believe nobody is allowed to stand except for the pastor and the bishop. And then there is the Holy of Holies, I think is what it's referred to as. It's Daddy's throne. It is a literal chair covered in a plastic tarp, and you're not allowed to sit or stand by Daddy's throne. It is a sacred space reserved for Sweet Daddy Cunningham. So I'm looking at all of this and I'm just waiting for the service to roll around. So I see the paintings of the bishop, I see Daddy's throne, I see the list of the top donors in the previous year. Finally, people start trickling into the service. To my shock and amazement, there were far fewer people here than there were in the last church that I went to, which is crazy because that building is so much smaller, but they packed it out. Whereas this place was huge and there were at most like 45 people there. Also, the band was much smaller. You know, a keyboardist, a drummer, a couple of vocalists, and a couple of trombonists are leading worship in the congregation. And a lot of what happened was similar, but the vibe and the tone was just so radically different. They sing some songs, some people get up to the mic and testify, and then they take up tithes and offerings. Now, I want to be clear, it's still weird. It's still, uncomfortable. But compared to what I saw at the last church, this was way more tame. First of all, they didn't do raffle tickets. I saw tickets somewhere, in the basement, so, stay on guard. But that song and dance, for what it's worth, was not a part of today's service. They also still counted up the money and publicly disclosed that information, and they also had kind of a going contest about which family gave the most money. That's kind of icky. And I'll get to this in a little while, but I'm willing to overlook some of these things because I'm wondering how many of them are quirks that were inherited from the denomination rather than things that this particular congregation actually wants to do. So the tithes and offerings still are not great, but they're better. And there certainly wasn't any of this nonsense of, oh, can we just get $135 more? They weren't nickel and diming people quite in the same way here. And then the pastor gets up and delivers his Mother's Day sermon. And it was good. It was really good. He started it kind of funny though. He gets up there and he's like, several years ago, there was a movement that started and it was called Black Lives Matter. But I want to tell you about a movement you haven't heard of. Mothers Matter. My dude's about to get canceled. It's so funny being the only white guy in the church and being uncomfortable with a joke like that. Oh gosh. But sincerely, the sermon was really good. He talked about Moses and Miriam. He talked about Jesus passing Mary off to the disciple John. It was very biblically rich. And he had all the theatrics and the hoopla, and it was fun seeing him get into it. But all of that stuff is just a veneer. But the meat and potatoes of the message were really good and encouraging to the mothers of the congregation. And now, let me be clear, this bishop does have an extreme devotion, an extreme reverence for Sweet Daddy Cunningham, but he wasn't really mentioned in the service. He was given an occasional honorific mention, but this was very Christ-centric, to the extent that if I were to take his sermon, if I were to take most of this service and transplant it into another church, it would be Orthodox. Like sincerely, it's almost mind-boggling that these are the same organization. Towards the end of the pastor's sermon, he starts, calling out individual church members and says, I want to give a round of applause for Miss Sheila, oldest member of this church, round of applause, and second oldest in this church, and Dan, I see you in the back there, welcome, brother, and then he called me by name and welcomed me, and, I was sitting there waving and thanking him. And then the pastor invites everyone to a, I think it was like Family and Friends Day or something. And so they had a free meal in the fellowship hall next to the soup kitchen, and he invited everyone to come and hang out there. Now, in between the sermon ending and me going and getting some food, I had probably like 5 really genuine encounters with people that were like off-putting because of how nice and good they were. I went up to one of the trombone players and shook his hand, and he was very genuine and warm with like, hey man, we're so glad you're here. Which was not the disposition of the last church at all. Like people told me that, but it felt like they were telling me, through like a, kind of a wince. And then I walk outside and I'm standing by, the 2 big lion statues, and I start talking to a couple of gentlemen out there, and he's like, yes sir, I've been here all my life, and man, I love it here. And look at that sign. It says House of Prayer for all people. And we don't care what skin color, ethnicity, background, doctrine, creed you got. If you're human, you're welcome here. And he was like, go get you some food, man. You must be hungry. And now I remember at the last church, the pastor offered to buy me a meal, which was very nice of him. But if I'm honest, it felt a little bit like he was showing off. Like, hey, I have this much money that I can, buy your meal for you. This was like, hey, come and grab a meal with us. It just felt good. And so I was a little bit hesitant because, I knew that I was going to be making a video about these people, and it feels like awkward if I have to shit on them after eating with them, obviously. But I'm really glad that I stayed, because it was a really good experience. I had a 20-minute conversation with the associate pastor's wife, who was a nurse. I was also cracking up with the associate pastor. And also, the food at this place was even better than the last place. But so as I'm talking to the associate pastor and his wife, we're just cutting it up and having a good time. And he brings up, oh man, my daughter, she's really into tattoos. And I don't think that the denomination, the church, is cool with that at all, which kind of tips me off to the fact that she might be deconverted. She might be totally secularized. But this associate pastor and his wife brought it up in a way that was kind of casual, and in a way that was, they still weren't thrilled about it. I think he said something like, yeah, I wish you would slow down with those. But the fact that he mentioned it at all, that's a good sign, because I know there are some Jehovah's Witnesses in the world who, if they go out and get tattoos and are not going to church anymore, they're dead to them. They don't talk about it. And so the fact that this daughter of theirs might not be in the UHOP anymore, and they're able to just, yeah, but she's still a daughter, and yeah, she makes some knucklehead decisions, but the fact that they weren't freaking out going oh, we used to have a daughter, that's a really good sign. That's really encouraging. So I thank everyone. I stand up, I walk out, I get a couple more thanks so much for coming. And I go in my car and I sit down, and I'm like, what the fuck just happened? I'm confused and conflicted and maybe even irritated at the feelings and the confusion that I have. I'm wondering if I was too harsh with my previous criticisms of the church. I'm wondering if this is a really good shtick. And then at about this time, I get a text message from a former member of the United House of Prayer. And this was a gentleman who deconverted several years ago. He slid into my DMs, and we've been having a really good back and forth. And I texted him, and I was like, dude, I had such a good, positive experience with this church. What the heck is going on? And he texted me and he said, now you understand why it was so hard to leave. Broke me, man. Just broke me. So here is what I think is happening. This church, this denomination, this cult is going through a metamorphosis, and we are watching it evolve in real time. Here is my hot, spicy take. Pretty much, almost universally, almost all religions start as cults. They start with a handful of people who are given a revelation by God. Usually it is, a singular leader. They are given strict ordinances on how to live, what to do, what not to do, and they break away from society to follow their religious inklings. After a couple of generations, there are complicated conversations about who the proper successor to the teacher or savior or master is. And then as the cult grows and gets more and more people, certain doctrines and dogmas become a little watered down, maybe a little mythologized, maybe a little spiritualized, and it goes from being very sectarian to very lax. And I think that that's what's happening here. And the tricky thing is that it's happening at different paces at different congregations. And I kind of need to temper myself a little bit, because I don't want that to sound belittling or upsetting to any UHOP members, because I can very easily imagine a UHOP member watching this video and saying, well, no, we need to stick to our guns. We need to, keep moving forward with the principles that Daddy gave us. And so there's tension there, because, the traditions run deep, and you want to be faithful to those traditions, but live them out in a way that's good for the community. So in the last church that I visited, I felt like I was walking through Beijing. There was nothing but red flags. This church had some red flags, but only if you're looking at it through the lens of being an Orthodox Christian. Yeah, there's some, heretical-ish stuff going on there. But even on that front, the way the pastor was explaining it, I don't think that it would strictly be considered heresy. Now, truthfully, the only really heretical element of their entire congregation is one, they're oneness Pentecostals.
That's modalism, Patrick.
What?
But beyond that, it's more so just that they believe that, you know, members of the United House of Prayer are the only true recipients of salvation. That's kind of problematic. But, you know, the pastor was very clear in saying, like, you know, but ultimately, I'm not the judge, God's the judge. I'm going to tell people what I know from the scriptures, you know, what I know from Sweet Daddy. But there was a kind of a sense of like, you know, but God's the judge, you know, but God is in control, which is a much healthier temperament to be in than, well, Daddy chose us and he chose our congregation, and if you're outside these four walls, you're doomed. So again, I mean, there was definitely stuff in the service that made me uncomfortable. At one point, everyone was kneeling towards the mountain of God, which feels kind of idolatrous. They were still announcing the highest donors of that Sunday, which feels icky. And at the beginning of the service, the pastor said, all right, let's clap for Jesus. All right, and let's clap for Bishop Cunningham. But if you zoom out, this place was just a lot healthier than the previous church that I went to. And that's kind of the crazy and upsetting thing, where I think the only variable was the people. You know, all of the doctrines and dogmas are the same, but it's interpreted through people, and these microcosms of culture at distinct congregations are being formed. And in some churches, it's terrible. It's awful. It's an entire culture built on, you know, sucking these people dry of all of their resources and time and energy and money. And then at this place, it felt okay. Like at the last place, I was ready to sound the alarms, you know, FBI and SWAT kicking down the door and looking for embezzlement money.
We're the SWAT boys. We use undue force.
But here, it was good. I was really impressed with the reception that these people gave me. So where the hell does this organization go from here? My hope and prayer, I don't pray, I'm an atheist, but my hope is that this is an opportunity with this new bishop for this church to become a full-fledged religion where they can become more closely integrated with other Protestant churches. I mean, I would be okay if the best case scenario were like, you know, give it 50 years and they're like, yeah, they have this weird obsession with their bishop and they think they're the only ones who are going to heaven, but yeah, you know, they're our brothers in Christ. That would be excellent. From talking to some of the former members, it sounds like there is the inklings of a reform movement coming. And hopefully it'll look something like, hey, God did divinely ordain these bishops to lead his church, but they were still fallible men who messed up. And my hope is that the church can get to a place where they can admit, yes, Bishop Bailey had a penchant for food and power, and it wasn't okay. He still did a lot of good for the community. He was still a man of God, but there were times where he slipped up. If Bishop Cunningham is able to take this thing by the horns and continue to lead these people, but tone down the money heckling and stress to the pastors under his domain that, hey, your first priority is to ensure the spiritual well-being of your congregants, then this place has the potential to be a good church community everywhere. Because there are churches that I've visited that have had wacky starts. They had kind of culty leaders at the beginning, but over the generations, they chilled out and they became better. They became kind of unique and quirky churches, but they were there to help people. They never dipped into the territory ever again of risking people's livelihoods or their status at work or risking, you know, being excommunicated from their families. And all it takes is for a bishop to step up and for pastors to walk in tandem with the bishop and encourage him to follow the straight and narrow. I don't know, nobody asked me for this opinion, nobody asked me for this advice, but I really want to see these people be okay. Because it was hard watching those people get taken advantage of at the last church. If every UHOP church in America looked like this one that I visited today, this would not be a cult. I'm still in the process of talking to former members of this church and current members because this is such a clusterfuck of different people and personalities and doctrines and creeds that are all coming together and evolving and exploding very quickly. And I just hope that as it gets bigger, it continues to look like this church, where they aren't sectarian. They're not barring the doors to an outsider. They're not afraid to shake my hand. They're not afraid of my questions. They're not afraid of me going in there and looking like a weirdo and sitting in their pews and being like, hey, what's up with this? Because I've seen cults and church end in tragedy, and I've also seen them not. All I want is for these people to be okay. All I want is for these people to not have to go through the pain and the suffering that a lot of cult members have through the years. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's a wrap. Thanks for being here. My name is Jared. I'm an atheist. Go to church.